Just sync in my audio. Yeah, I use a dog clicker for that. So this is a question that every photographer gets asked at one time or another. You may even have been asked the question yourself by another photographer. So, do I edit my photography? Or in other words, do I edit my photos? Do I crop my images? Do I use Lightroom to get the result I want, or do I get it right in camera? How long do I spend editing each picture? Do I use traditional filters or use Lightroom Grad instead? Or, as a non-photographer may ask, is that image photoshopped? Digital photography, for me, has always had a downside. Having to process your own images was never a thing I had to do back when I shot film. Shooting with transparency film, usually Fuji Velvia, you had to get it right in camera. You then sent your films off to be developed. If you got anything wrong in camera, it was too late. Exposure had to be correct within half a stop. Bad results couldn't be recovered like they can now. If you lost shadow detail, too bad. If you blew out the highlights, well, there was only one place for that picture, and that was in the bin. If you made a mistake and you didn't bracket your shots to allow for errors, well, in my case, I wasn't going to have a result to sell. Simple as. Exposures then had to be spot on, and photography back then, in many ways, was purely about the picture taken side. Well, unless you shot black and white and had access to a traditional darkroom. Most processing labs have closed now, gone bust, so it's actually quite hard to get film processed these days. That's why I now process my own black and white film images. But now with digital, that outsourcing has changed. You, the photographer, now process your own work then. You are the photographer and the processor. No wonder most labs have gone out of business. But of course, this is a skill all of its own that you have to master alongside taking a decent picture in the first place. For many creative photographers then, the processing can be where it all actually begins. Some photographers love to manipulate their images. They enjoy this side of photography too, turning their captures into the creation they envisaged, or maybe long before they're pressing the shutter. Of course, you may be the other type of photographer, like me, who doesn't like the processing side, and you therefore try to get it as right in camera as much as you can. My photography is out there. No, out there, in the landscape or in the city. Sat at home in front of this computer, processing results is just reducing my shooting time. It's not something I really enjoy. But as I do shoot raw, like many of you, I do have to process my results. Therefore, yes, I do edit my images. I don't really shoot JPEGs where the camera processes the images in camera. And that's because I do like to have full control of my work. And my images do, usually, look better once I have processed my raw files compared to the matching JPEG. I do a better job than the camera, thankfully. However, that said, a lot of times there isn't that much difference. The camera does a good job most of the time, and that's because of the way I shoot. I try to capture as good an image as possible in camera, so the camera has an easy job, and more importantly, I then have an easier editing process to do later on. Therefore, when I process my raw file, I'm not wanting or trying to recover lost detail if I can help it. I'm not needing to heavily crop the image to change its composition and format. I'm not merging multiple images for exposure control or to help increase depth of field. I work with my camera and the conditions to produce good results in camera that are as near as possible to the final result as I can get. If the conditions are wrong, I just make a return visit on another day. Simple as that. So yes, I still use filters to control contrast and balance exposure. I expose for the shadows, or I will purposely underexpose if I'm happy to lose the shadow detail, for mood, or to fully retain detail in the highlights alone. The biggest change I will make is to convert the original colour raw file to black and white. But again, if I put the camera into its monochrome mode when shooting, my final result then looks very similar to the resulting black and white JPEG created in camera. The camera does a good job again here, depending which camera I'm using. But again, I like to have the final say, even on this, and to create the black and white result that I want. So should we all just be shooting JPEGs instead and just make do? I guess it would put us all on more of a level playing field if we did, if that's all we had. If there was no Photoshop or Lightroom or any other image editing software for our RAW files, if RAW didn't exist, we'd have to shoot JPEG. So anyone who is more skillful on the computer with Photoshop may have less advantage if this was the case. It would probably also mean YouTube would lose all its 5 secret Lightroom features you must know type videos, and that might not be a bad thing. So yes, I do edit my photos because I process my images as I shoot RAW, so I have to. I think as a beginner, you should understand though that some of the images you drool over, which you wish you could take something of similar impact, may have been created with lots of post-processing work. The world doesn't look like that most of the time, even in the best light. It's okay though for the photographer to manipulate their images in that way. After all, it's their art and therefore their rules. But if you want your images to look similar, then be aware that using a camera and shooting JPEGs alone may not get you there. So for all the reasons I've already mentioned, I've never really recorded a post-processing video myself. There are 2 older ones on my E6 subscription, but even these have changed probably to how I process my images nowadays. I think those type of videos are a bit boring. I probably don't even have the skills to teach you anything that you may not already know. I don't use all the controls and features available to me in Photoshop or Lightroom. I don't use layers in Photoshop or use radial filters or grads or whatever. I don't know how to use them, but I don't seem to need them either. If my images don't look right after processing the RAW file, then I'll either bin it or I will have to shoot it again when conditions are different, which is probably what was really required. Luckily, I do know enough about Photoshop to get the results I'm happy with. However, I never really spend more than about 5 minutes editing each of my images. Again, if it's taken longer than this, then it gets deleted, as it obviously just wasn't right in the first place. Funnily, I'm what I would call an imperfect perfectionist. I like things to be right, perfect even, but I can also accept failure or imperfections. I'm not overcritical of my own work. I strive to get things as right as I can, as much as I can, but I also work with the faults and failings. I accept faults, and I can accept the faults in photography and in an image that perhaps others may not. It's here where I see photography purely as an art form, an expression of oneself, with faults, warts and all. I use my use of Polaroid, Holga and pinhole cameras as proof of this. I accept noise from using high ISO settings. I definitely don't insist on squeaky clean results, only taken at 100 ISO. I will even accept a loss of sharpness sometimes. A picture can still tell a story if it's slightly out of focus, unsharp, or even not perfectly exposed or composed. There's more to photography than the technicalities, and I think we forget that sometimes, as I've mentioned in previous videos. So I shoot RAW, but I sometimes shoot in black and white mode in camera and therefore shoot a JPEG too, but most of the time I can envisage the black and white result by shooting in standard colour mode and just convert it later. I use filters to help the camera with its dynamic range, but I'm also able to accept some burnout in my results or lack of shadow detail. My compositions are 90% perfect in camera, and I change lenses to frame up carefully for this or crop with different formats in camera to again frame up as precisely as I can. My post edits consist more of fine tuning than fully editing then. I tweak the exposure and contrast to my liking, but I'm not really changing anything. I'm just using the data in the RAW file to bring the image back to what I originally saw in the viewfinder. Again, I fine-tune my crops where needs be, but I've never changed a vertical capture into a horizontal one and vice versa. My square crops are captured in camera too, mainly to assist with framing, and therefore they're already cropped, in most cases, when I process that result. In Photoshop, I dodge and burn where needs be, and I do like the use of those tools for finer detailed contrast adjustment. And of course, I fine-tune the white balance as a final procedure too. as if you don't know, I always have my camera set to the sunny white balance setting by default. If you've ever been on one of my workshops, you'll know why this is. Of course, I wouldn't if I was only shooting JPEGs. So I wonder how many photographers would cope if they could only shoot JPEGs. Would their images change at all? We all might have to work harder and be more precise with our in-camera shooting if we did. So would this put more skill and emphasis on using the camera again, as it was perhaps in the days of colour film? Oh, and finally, one bit of advice for anyone out there wanting to improve their editing skills. Don't buy presets. I don't sell them, never have and never will. Well, I'll say probably, as I don't like saying never, as you never know what the hard times will be like. The last thing you want is for your images to look like another photographer's results. I just don't see the point of that. Your photography should be unique to you, not like someone else's. You only need to move a few sliders in your editing software to change the look of your image. So just experiment, just like I have. You don't need to do much to give your result a unique look. And remember, those sliders don't have to be set to 100% each. Most images won't need to be changed more than about 20% on each adjustment. Less is more then. And if your images still don't look right after any adjustments, then the question you want to ask yourself isn't, how do I process this? What processing skill do I need to learn? Instead, it may be, what didn't I do right out there in the field? So don't rely so much on post-processing to get a great result. Otherwise, well, we'll all just succumb to the world of AI. And nobody wants that, do we?